The rain hammered against the windows of the small coffee shop like angry fists. Sarah wiped down the counter for the 10th time that evening, watching the storm rage outside. The weather forecast had warned about severe thunderstorms, but she never expected it to be this violent. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, followed by thunder that shook the building's foundation. At 26, Sarah had been running her grandmother's coffee shop for 3 years. The little place on Maple Street wasn't much to look at, but it had character. Mismatched chairs, vintage posters on the walls, and the constant smell of fresh coffee beans created a warm atmosphere that regular customers loved. Tonight, however, she was completely alone. She glanced at the clock. 9:30. She should have closed an hour ago, but something kept her there. Maybe it was the way the storm reminded her of the night her grandmother passed away, or maybe she just didn't want to drive home in this weather. A sharp knock at the front door made her jump. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see a tall figure hunched against the storm. The person knocked again, more urgently this time. Sarah hesitated. The sign clearly said, "Closed," and her father had always warned her about letting strangers in after dark. Another flash of lightning illuminated the figure outside. It was a man, soaked to the bone, and he looked genuinely distressed. His expensive-looking suit was ruined by the rain, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be following him. Sarah's compassionate nature won over her caution. She unlocked the door and pulled it open, immediately feeling the force of the wind and rain. "Please," the man said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I need help." "Come in, come in." Sarah stepped aside, and he rushed through the doorway. She quickly locked the door behind him and turned to get her first good look at her unexpected visitor. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that was now plastered to his head from the rain. His suit, though soaked, was clearly expensive, the kind of tailored clothing she'd only seen in magazines. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a deep brown, almost black, and they held a mixture of relief and something else she couldn't quite identify. Wariness, maybe, or exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, water dripping from his clothes onto her grandmother's old wooden floors. "I'm sorry to bother you. I saw the lights and thought maybe—" "No problem at all," Sarah said, already moving toward the storage room. "Let me get you some towels. You're absolutely soaked." When she returned with an armload of clean towels, she found him standing exactly where she'd left him, as if he was afraid to move further into the space without permission. There was something almost formal about his posture, despite his bedraggled appearance. "Here," she said, handing him the towels. "I'm Sarah, by the way. This is my coffee shop." He accepted the towels gratefully and began drying his hair. "Marco," he said simply. "And thank you again. I wouldn't have blamed you for keeping the door locked." Sarah busied herself making fresh coffee, stealing glances at her unexpected guest. Now that he was drying off, she could see that he was quite handsome. But there was something about him that seemed different from the usual customers who wandered into her shop. He carried himself with a kind of authority that suggested he was used to being in charge. "So, what brings you out in weather like this?" she asked, trying to sound casual as she measured coffee grounds. Marco hesitated, wringing out his jacket. "My car broke down about 6 blocks from here. Phone's dead, too. Got soaked when I was trying to flag down help." He gestured toward the window. "Not exactly the kind of night where people stop to help strangers." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I can imagine. This storm came out of nowhere. The weather service said it might be the worst we've seen all year." "You're very kind," Marco said. And there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't used to receiving kindness from strangers. Most people would have pretended they didn't hear the knocking. "Most people aren't as stubborn as I am," Sarah replied with a small smile. "My grandmother always said this place should be a refuge for anyone who needs it. Guess old habits die hard." The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the shop with its familiar, comforting aroma. Sarah pulled down 2 mugs from the shelf and realized she felt oddly comfortable with this stranger. Usually she was shy around new people, especially men. But something about Marco put her at ease, despite the mysterious circumstances of his arrival. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman," Marco said, carefully hanging his suit jacket over the back of a chair. "She was. She built this place from nothing back in the 70s. Always said coffee brought people together, no matter what their differences were." Marco smiled for the first time since entering the shop, and Sarah noticed how it completely transformed his face. The wariness in his eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked younger, less burdened. "She was right," he said. "There's something about sharing coffee that makes everything seem more manageable." Sarah poured 2 steaming mugs and carried them to the table where Marco had settled. As she set his mug down, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach. She quickly pulled her hand away, hoping he hadn't noticed her reaction. "So, you run this place by yourself?" Marco asked, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Mostly, yeah. I have 2 part-time employees who help during the day, but evenings are usually just me. I like the quiet time. Gives me a chance to catch up on paperwork, try new recipes, that sort of thing." Marco nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. His eyes widened slightly. "This is excellent, really excellent." "Thanks. It's my grandmother's secret blend. I've never told anyone the exact recipe." "Some secrets are worth keeping," Marco said. And again, Sarah caught that hint of something deeper in his voice. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm rage outside. Sarah found herself studying Marco's hands as he held his mug. They were well manicured but strong, with a small scar across the knuckles of his right hand. She wondered what his story was, what had brought him to her door on this wild night. "Do you live around here?" she asked eventually. "Not far," Marco replied, which wasn't really an answer. "What about you? Do you live above the shop?" "No, I have a small apartment about 15 minutes away. Though on nights like this, I sometimes wonder if I should just sleep on the couch here." Marco glanced toward the front windows, where the storm showed no signs of letting up. "It really is getting worse out there. Are you sure you should be going home tonight?" There was genuine concern in his voice, and Sarah felt that flutter in her stomach again. It had been a long time since someone had worried about her well-being. Really worried, not just asked out of politeness. "I'll be fine," she said. "I've got good tires and I know these roads like the back of my hand." "Still," Marco said, "maybe you should wait until it calms down a bit. I'd hate to think of you driving in this." Sarah looked at him curiously. There was something almost protective in his tone, which was strange considering they'd just met, but she found she didn't mind it. After 3 years of handling everything on her own, it was nice to have someone express concern for her safety. "What about you?" she asked. "How are you planning to get home?" Marco's expression grew complicated. "I'm not sure yet. I'll figure something out." Before Sarah could respond, a massive clap of thunder shook the building, and the lights flickered. Both of them looked up at the ceiling, waiting to see if the power would hold. "That sounded close," Sarah murmured. "Very close," Marco agreed. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the storm. "Sarah, is there a back exit to this place?" The question struck her as odd. "Yes. Why?" Marco was silent for a moment, still staring out the window. "I thought I saw car headlights, but they just disappeared. Probably nothing." But Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, and she realized that Marco might be more worried about something than just the storm. Before she could ask him about it, another bolt of lightning lit up the sky, and she saw what had caught his attention. Two black cars were parked across the street, barely visible through the rain. As she watched, she could see figures moving around the vehicles. "Marco," she said quietly, "what's going on?" He turned away from the window, and she saw that the wariness was back in his eyes, stronger than before. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anyone else who knows you're here tonight? Anyone who might come looking for you?" The seriousness in his voice scared her a little. "No, nobody knows I'm here. I didn't plan to stay this late. It just happened. Marco, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" Marco ran his hand through his still damp hair, clearly wrestling with some kind of decision. Finally, he looked directly at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. Not with attraction this time, but with fear. "Sarah, there are some things about me that you don't know. Things that might put you in danger just by being around me. I never should have come here." "What are you talking about?" Before Marco could answer, they heard the sound of car doors slamming outside. The headlights Sarah had seen were no longer hidden. Two black sedans were now parked directly in front of the coffee shop, their engines still running. Marco cursed under his breath in what sounded like Italian. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Go to the back room and stay there until I tell you it's safe to come out. Don't come out no matter what you hear, understand?" "No, I don't understand. Marco, what's happening?" 3 sharp knocks echoed through the shop, much louder and more aggressive than Marco's had been. Marco looked at Sarah with an expression that was part apology, part desperation. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry I brought this to your door." The knocking came again, harder this time, and Sarah heard a man's voice calling out something in Italian. Whatever he was saying, it made Marco's face go pale. "Go," Marco said urgently. "Please, Sarah, go to the back room and lock the door. Don't come out until you hear my voice telling you it's safe." Sarah's mind was spinning. An hour ago, she'd been alone in her quiet coffee shop, and now she was hiding from mysterious men in black cars while a stranger who claimed to be protecting her stood between her and unknown danger. But as she looked at Marco, she realized that despite everything, she trusted him. Maybe it was the way he'd thanked her so genuinely for her kindness, or the concern he'd shown for her safety, but something told her that whatever trouble had followed him here, he was trying to keep her out of it. "Be careful," she whispered, and then she ran toward the back room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. As she reached the storage room door, she heard Marco walk to the front of the shop. Through the thin walls, she could hear him speaking in rapid Italian to whoever was outside. His voice was completely different now, commanding, authoritative, with an edge of danger that made her shiver. Sarah pressed her ear to the door, trying to understand what was happening. The conversation outside grew more heated, with multiple voices now shouting over the thunder. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Then she heard the front door of her shop open, and heavy footsteps on her grandmother's wooden floors. Strange voices filled the space where she'd been peacefully making coffee just minutes before. Marco's voice rose above the others, speaking in English now. "This place has nothing to do with our business. The woman who owns it is innocent." "That's not for you to decide anymore," replied another voice, heavily accented. "You know the rules, Marco. You disappeared. People started asking questions. I needed time to think." "Time to think?" The stranger's voice was mocking. "Or time to plan your escape?" Sarah's blood ran cold as the pieces began to fall into place. Whatever Marco was involved in, it was serious enough that people were tracking him down in the middle of a storm. And now her coffee shop, her grandmother's legacy, was in the middle of it. She heard furniture being moved around and the sound of drawers being opened. They were searching for something. "Where is it, Marco?" the accented voice demanded. I told you, I don't have it with me. Then where? Marco's response was too quiet for Sarah to hear, but whatever he said made one of the other men laugh. A cold, unpleasant sound. You always were too soft, the man said. Your father would be disappointed. Leave my father out of this. Your father built an empire, and you want to throw it away for what? A normal life? You know that's impossible. Sarah's hands were shaking now. Empire? What kind of empire? And why was it impossible for Marco to have a normal life? The conversation continued, but the voices moved toward the front of the shop, making it harder for her to hear. She caught fragments, something about loyalty, about family obligations, about choices that couldn't be undone. Then suddenly everything went quiet, except for the storm outside. Sarah waited, barely breathing, for some sign of what was happening. Had they left? Was Marco okay? The silence stretched on until she couldn't stand it anymore. Against his instructions, she cracked open the storage room door just enough to peek out. The main area of the shop was empty, but the front door stood wide open, rain blowing in and soaking the floor. Marco was nowhere to be seen. Sarah's heart sank. Had they taken him? Had he gone with them willingly? She stood there for several minutes, torn between relief that the danger seemed to have passed, and worry about what had happened to the mysterious man who had sought shelter in her shop. Just as she was about to venture out of the storage room, she heard footsteps on the front porch. She ducked back behind the door, her heart racing again. "Sarah?" Marco's voice called out. "It's okay. They're gone." She opened the door and saw him standing in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair again. He looked exhausted and older somehow, as if the conversation with the strange men had aged him years in minutes. "Are you hurt?" she asked, rushing toward him. "No, I'm fine. But Sarah, I need to leave. Tonight. And I can't come back." The finality in his voice hit her like a physical blow. She'd known this stranger for less than 2 hours, but somehow the thought of him disappearing into the night left her feeling hollow. "I don't understand any of this," she said. "Who were those men? What did they want?" Marco closed and locked the front door, then turned to face her. In the soft lighting of the coffee shop, she could see the conflict written across his features. "The less you know, the safer you'll be," he said. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. Meeting you tonight, the kindness you showed me, it means more than you can possibly imagine." "Then stay," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Whatever trouble you're in, maybe there's another way to handle it." Marco smiled sadly. "There's no other way. Not for someone like me." "What do you mean, someone like you?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if he was trying to memorize it. "My name is Marco Rossi," he said finally, "and my family is not like other families." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the weight with which he said it suggested it should have. She waited for him to continue. "Those men work for me, or rather they work for the family business. And tonight, I was supposed to make a decision that I've been putting off for months." "What kind of decision?" Marco walked to the window and looked out at the storm, which was finally beginning to show signs of weakening. "Whether to take over as head of the family when my father retires," he said. "It's not the kind of business where you can just say no and walk away. It's not the kind of life where you can run a coffee shop or fall in love or do any of the normal things that normal people do." Sarah felt her world shift as understanding began to dawn. The expensive suit, the formal way he carried himself, the fear in the men's voices when they spoke to him, the talk of empires and family obligations that couldn't be undone. "Marco," she said quietly, "what kind of family business are we talking about?" He turned back to her, and she saw in his eyes the answer she was both expecting and dreading. The kind that makes people disappear when they ask too many questions, he said simply. The kind that controls territories and settles disputes with violence. The kind that my grandfather started when he came to this country with nothing but ambition and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. Sarah sank into a chair, her mind reeling. She'd opened her door to someone seeking shelter from a storm, and instead she'd let in someone who lived in a world she'd only seen in movies. You're... She couldn't finish the sentence. Yeah, Marco said. I'm exactly what you think I am. The silence that followed Marco's confession stretched between them like a chasm. Sarah stared at him, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had thanked her so graciously for her kindness with what he had just told her about his family. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, but inside the coffee shop, the atmosphere had become charged with a different kind of tension. I should be terrified of you, Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco's shoulders sagged. Yes, you should be. But I'm not. He looked up at her in surprise. Sarah, you don't understand what I'm telling you. My family controls half the businesses in this city. We own judges, police officers, politicians. People who cross us end up in the river or they simply disappear. And I'm supposed to be the next in line to run it all. Sarah stood up and walked to where he stood by the window. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the lightning was now just distant flashes on the horizon. But you don't want that life, she said. It wasn't a question. Marco let out a bitter laugh. Want has nothing to do with it. I was born into this family. I've been groomed for this role since I was old enough to understand what power meant. There's no getting out. There's always a choice. Not for me. Marco turned away from the window to face her fully. Do you know what I was doing tonight before the storm hit? I was sitting in my car trying to work up the courage to either go to the meeting where they expected me to accept my father's position or to drive as far away as I could get before they caught up with me. What stopped you? The storm. And then... finding this place. Finding you. His voice grew softer. For the first time in my life, someone showed me kindness without wanting anything in return, without knowing who I was or what my name could do for them. Sarah felt her heart breaking for this man who seemed to carry the weight of impossible choices on his shoulders. She thought about her own life, how simple it was, how peaceful. Her biggest worry most days was whether she'd ordered enough coffee beans for the week. But looking at Marco, she realized that simplicity was a luxury not everyone could afford. What happens now? She asked. Now I disappear. Tonight. Before they decide that letting me walk away was a mistake. And then what? You spend the rest of your life running? Marco shrugged. It's better than the alternative. Sarah moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The weight of years of living in a world where trust was a liability and genuine connection was a dangerous luxury. What if there was another way? There isn't. What if there was? She pressed. What if you didn't have to choose between running away and taking over your father's business? What if there was a third option? Marco shook his head. Sarah, you're thinking like someone who lives in the normal world. In my world, there are only two kinds of people, those who have power and those who serve it. There's no in-between. Then maybe it's time someone changed the rules. The words surprised even Sarah as she said them. She wasn't naturally a confrontational person. She liked her quiet life, her predictable routines, her small circle of regular customers who knew their orders by heart. But something about Marco's resignation, his acceptance that he had no choice, stirred something fierce in her chest. You don't know what you're saying, Marco said. Maybe not. But I know what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a man who spent his whole life being told who he has to be, and he's never had anyone tell him that he could be someone else. Marco was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Why do you care? You don't even know me. It was a fair question, and Sarah found herself struggling to answer it. Why did she care? Why was she standing here trying to convince a virtual stranger to upend his entire life based on a few hours of conversation? Because, she said finally, in the 2 hours since you walked through that door, you've shown me more genuine gratitude and concern than most people I've known for years. Because when those men came looking for you, your first instinct was to protect me, even though I was just a stranger who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because when you told me about your family, you looked ashamed instead of proud. I should be proud, Marco said. My family built something from nothing. They created opportunities, protected neighborhoods, provided for people who had nowhere else to turn. Is that what you believe? Or is that what you've been taught to believe? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah could see Marco wrestling with it, years of conditioning warring with something deeper and more honest. I used to believe it, he admitted. When I was younger, I thought we were the good guys. We helped people who couldn't help themselves. We solved problems that the police couldn't or wouldn't solve. But as I got older, I started to see the other side of it. The fear in people's eyes when they saw me coming. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The knowledge that every dollar in my pocket came from someone else's desperation or terror. So you do want out. Of course I want out. But wanting something and being able to have it are two different things. My father has invested 30 years in preparing me for this role. My uncles, my cousins, they all expect me to step up. And the people who work for us, they need to know there's continuity, that the organization will continue to protect them and their families. Sarah walked over to the coffee maker and poured herself another cup, using the familiar motions to give herself time to think. When she turned back, Marco was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What if you could find a way to transition out gradually? She suggested. What if instead of running away or taking over completely, you could work to change things from the inside? Marco smiled sadly. You really have no idea how this world works, do you? People like my father, my uncles, they didn't get where they are by compromising or gradually changing things. They got there by being willing to do whatever it takes, whenever it needs to be done. You can't reform an organization built on violence and fear. Maybe not. But maybe you could build something new. With what? I've never had a legitimate job in my life. Everything I know, every skill I have is related to the family business. I couldn't even get hired to manage a grocery store, let alone build some kind of alternative empire. Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked around the small shop that had been her life for the past 3 years. The mismatched furniture, the vintage posters, the smell of coffee beans and old wood. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was honest. It was the kind of place where people came not because they had to, but because they wanted to. You know, she said slowly, my grandmother started this place with nothing but a coffee pot and a dream. She didn't know anything about running a business. She'd never even worked outside the home before my grandfather died. But she knew how to make people feel welcome, and she knew that everyone needs a place where they can feel safe. What's your point? My point is that maybe you know more about building something legitimate than you think. You said yourself that your family provides for people, protects neighborhoods. What if you could do that without the violence? What if you could create something that gave people the same sense of security and community, but in a way that actually helped them instead of trapped them? Marco stared at her for a long moment. You're talking about giving up everything I've ever known, everyone I've ever been connected to start over from scratch. I'm talking about becoming the person you actually want to be, instead of the person you've been told you have to be. Before Marco could respond, they both heard the sound of a car engine outside. Marco tensed immediately, moving to the window to peer out. Sarah followed, her heart racing again. A single black car was parked across the street, its engine running. As they watched, the driver's side door opened, and a man in an expensive overcoat stepped out. He was older than the men who had been there earlier, with silver hair and the kind of presence that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "That's my father," Marco said quietly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd seen enough movies to know that when the boss showed up personally, it usually meant the situation had escalated far beyond a simple conversation. What does he want? Probably to finish the conversation those other men started, or to make sure I understand that walking away isn't an option. Marco moved away from the window and turned to face Sarah. "I need you to go back to the storage room, lock the door, and don't come out until I tell you to." "No, Sarah, this isn't a request. My father is not like the men who were here earlier. He's not going to be impressed by your innocence or charmed by your coffee shop. If he thinks you're a complication, he'll eliminate you without a second thought." "Then don't let me be a complication." Marco looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that if you're going to make a choice tonight, really make a choice, then you need to do it now while you still can. Once you walk out that door with your father, you'll never get another chance." "And what exactly are you suggesting I do? Tell him I've decided to quit the family business and open a coffee shop?" "Why not?" Marco laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because he would have you killed just for being witness to this conversation, and then he'd drag me home and remind me of exactly what happens to people who try to leave the family." Sarah felt fear creep up her spine, but she pushed it down. "Then don't tell him about me. Tell him you've been thinking about everything, and you've realized that you're not ready to take over yet. Tell him you need more time." "He's not going to accept that. Not tonight. Not after I disappeared for 6 hours and made everyone think I might be planning to run. Then make him accept it." Marco stared at her. "How?" Sarah took a deep breath. "By showing him that you're not running away from responsibility. By showing him that you're thinking strategically about what's best for the family business." "I don't follow." Sarah moved closer, her mind racing as the idea formed. "You said yourself that the organization needs continuity, stability. What if you told your father that you've been thinking about expansion, about moving into new territories or new types of businesses? What if you convinced him that you need time to develop a comprehensive plan for growing the family's influence?" Marco was quiet for a moment, considering. "That might buy me some time, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. Eventually, he'd expect to see results. Then we'd better make sure there are results to show." "We?" The word slipped out before Sarah had time to think about it. But once it was spoken, she realized she meant it. "I mean, if you're serious about wanting to change your life, you're going to need help. You're going to need someone who understands how legitimate businesses work." "Sarah, you run a coffee shop. That's hardly the same as managing a criminal organization. No, it's not. But it's a start. And maybe that's what you need. Not some grand master plan, but just a start." Before Marco could respond, there was a firm knock at the front door. Not the aggressive pounding of earlier, but the confident knock of someone who expected to be answered. Marco's father stood on the other side of the glass, waiting patiently. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see the family resemblance. The same dark eyes, the same authoritative bearing. But where Marco's eyes held conflict and uncertainty, his father's held only cold calculation. "He's not going to wait much longer," Marco said. "Then don't keep him waiting. Go talk to him." "And say what?" Sarah looked around the coffee shop one more time, taking in the peaceful atmosphere that had been her whole world just a few hours ago. Then she looked at Marco, this complicated man who had stumbled into her life and somehow made her want to be braver than she'd ever been before. "Tell him you've been thinking about the future," she said. Tell him you want to discuss expanding into legitimate businesses alongside the traditional operations. Tell him you've identified some opportunities that could be very profitable if handled correctly. What opportunities? Coffee shops, restaurants, small businesses that serve communities and bring people together. The kind of places that could provide cover for traditional operations while also generating clean income. Marco's eyes widened as he understood what she was suggesting. You want me to tell my father that I think we should go legitimate? I want you to tell your father that you think the family should diversify, that you've been studying successful organizations, and the ones that last are the ones that adapt to changing times. And you think he'll go for that? I think he'll be impressed that you're thinking strategically instead of emotionally. I think he'll see it as evidence that you're ready to lead. Marco was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words. Outside, his father knocked again, more insistently this time. If this backfires, Marco said, we're both dead. If you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been. Marco looked at her one last time, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. The resignation was fading, replaced by something that looked like determination. Stay in the back room, he said. No matter what you hear, don't come out unless I call for you. And Sarah? Yeah? If this goes wrong, if something happens to me, you need to forget you ever saw me tonight. Forget my name, forget everything I told you. Can you promise me that? Sarah wanted to promise, wanted to give him the reassurance he was asking for. But looking into his eyes, she knew she couldn't make that promise honestly. I can promise you that I'll be careful, she said, but I can't promise to forget. Not anymore. Marco nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected. Then he walked to the front door, took a deep breath, and opened it to face his father. Papa, Sarah heard him say in Italian, we need to talk. As the two men began to speak, Sarah retreated to the storage room, but this time she left the door slightly ajar. Whatever happened next would determine not just Marco's future, but possibly hers as well. She'd made her choice the moment she decided to help him think through his options, instead of simply letting him disappear into the night. Now all she could do was wait and hope that together they'd found a path that led somewhere other than destruction. From the storage room, Sarah could hear the low murmur of conversation between Marco and his father. They spoke primarily in Italian, their voices rising and falling in what sounded like a careful negotiation. She caught fragments in English, words like expansion, legitimate, and future, that suggested Marco was following through on the plan they'd discussed. The conversation went on for nearly 20 minutes. Sarah found herself holding her breath during the silences, wondering if each pause meant that Marco's father was considering the proposal or preparing to reject it entirely. She'd never felt so invested in a conversation she couldn't understand, with people she'd never met until tonight. Finally, she heard the front door close, followed by the sound of a car engine starting and driving away. The coffee shop fell silent except for the gentle patter of rain that was all that remained of the earlier storm. Sarah, Marco's voice called softly. You can come out now. She opened the storage room door to find Marco sitting at one of the small tables, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, as if the conversation had drained every ounce of energy he possessed. How did it go? She asked, approaching cautiously. Marco looked up at her, and she was surprised to see something that looked like hope in his eyes. Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. What does that mean? It means he didn't have me killed for suggesting we go legitimate. But it also means he's going to hold me to every word I said. Sarah sat down across from him, her heart still racing from the tension of the past hour. What exactly did you tell him? Everything you suggested, more or less. I told him I'd been thinking about the long-term stability of the family business, and I'd identified some opportunities for expansion into legitimate enterprises. I said I wanted to start small, with businesses that could serve both as income generators and as fronts for traditional operations. And he believed you? Marco smiled ruefully. My father didn't become the head of one of the most powerful crime families in the city by being easy to fool, but he also didn't get there by ignoring good business sense. The idea of diversifying into legitimate businesses isn't completely crazy. Several other families have done it successfully. So, what's the catch? The catch is that he's given me 6 months to show him a working model. If I can prove that this approach can be profitable and sustainable, he'll consider letting me implement it on a larger scale. If I can't, if you can't. If I can't, I take over the traditional operations as planned. And we never speak of tonight again. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. 6 months wasn't very long to prove that a completely different approach to organized crime could work, but it was more time than Marco had expected to have, and it was a real chance to change the trajectory of his life. What kind of businesses does he want you to start with? That's up to me, but he wants to see detailed plans, financial projections, and proof that whatever I choose can actually turn a profit. He's treating this like a business proposal, which means I need to treat it like one too. Sarah looked around her grandmother's coffee shop, seeing it with new eyes. It was small, certainly, but it was profitable. It served a real need in the community. And most importantly, it was the kind of place where people felt safe and welcome, exactly the kind of atmosphere Marco had described wanting to create. What if we started here? She said. Here. What if your first legitimate business was expanding this coffee shop? You could invest in renovations, maybe add some additional locations, turn it into a small chain. It's already profitable, it has a good reputation in the community, and it would give you hands-on experience with running a legitimate business. Marco stared at her. Sarah, you can't be serious. You're talking about going into business with someone whose family makes people disappear for a living. I'm talking about going into business with someone who wants to build something better. You don't know me. Not really. A few hours of conversation doesn't tell you who I am or what I'm capable of. Sarah considered this. It was true that she didn't know Marco well, but she knew herself, and she knew that her instincts about people were usually reliable. More importantly, she knew that some opportunities only came once, and spending too much time analyzing them was a good way to miss them entirely. You're right, she said. I don't know you very well. But I know that you could have told your father anything tonight, and you chose to tell him something that might actually make the world a little bit better. I know that when those men came looking for you, you tried to protect me even though you had no reason to care about my safety. And I know that in the 3 years I've been running this place, I've never had a customer show as much genuine appreciation for simple kindness as you did tonight. That doesn't mean I'm someone you should trust with your business or your life. Maybe not, but it means you're someone worth taking a chance on. Marco was quiet for a long moment, looking around the coffee shop. Sarah could see him trying to imagine it transformed, expanded, turned into something larger, while still maintaining its essential character. Even if you're willing to take that risk, he said finally, there are practical considerations. My father's money isn't exactly clean. If we're going to do this legitimately, we need to make sure everything is legal and above board. Can you get access to clean money? Some. I have personal savings that aren't directly connected to family business. It's not a huge amount, but it might be enough for a start. Sarah pulled out a notebook from behind the counter and began sketching rough numbers. The lease on this place is up for renewal in 6 months, which is perfect timing. If we can show the landlord that we're planning significant improvements, we might be able to negotiate a longer-term deal at a good rate. And there's an empty storefront 2 blocks from here that would be perfect for a second location. As she spoke, she could see Marco's expression changing. The exhaustion was giving way to something that looked like genuine interest, and for the first time since she'd met him, he seemed to be looking forward instead of backward. You've really thought about expanding before, he observed. I've dreamed about it. But dreams and reality are two different things. This place generates enough income to support me, but not enough to fund major expansion. I've looked into loans, but banks aren't exactly eager to lend money to single women with limited collateral. What if money wasn't an issue? What would you do? Sarah felt a flutter of excitement as she allowed herself to really consider the possibilities. I'd renovate this location first, expand the seating area, add a small kitchen so we could serve food as well as coffee, maybe create a space for community events. Then I'd open a second location in the business district downtown, somewhere that could cater to the office crowd during the day and the after-work social scene in the evenings. And after that? After that? If the first two were successful, maybe a third location near the university? College students live on coffee, and they'd appreciate a place that stays open late for studying. Eventually, maybe we could franchise the concept, help other people start their own coffee shops using our model. Marco smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely happy since he'd walked through her door. You know, he said, listening to you talk about this, I can actually picture it working. Really? Really? You understand people. What they want, what makes them feel comfortable and welcome. That's not a skill you can teach, and it's not something most business schools cover in their curricula. Sarah felt a warm glow at the compliment, but she also felt the weight of what they were discussing. Marco, if we do this, if we actually try to build something together, there are going to be people who want to know where your investment money came from. How do we handle that? Very carefully. Any money I invest would have to be completely clean, traceable, taxed, legitimate in every way. It would take some time to arrange, but it can be done. And what about your family? Are they going to be okay with you spending your time running coffee shops instead of doing whatever it is you usually do for them? Marco's expression grew more serious. That's the complicated part. My father agreed to give me 6 months to prove this concept, but he didn't agree to let me step back from family responsibilities during that time. I'll still have to handle certain obligations. Sarah felt a chill. What kind of obligations? The kind it's better for you not to know about. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we become business partners, there may be times when I have to handle family business that has nothing to do with our coffee shops. I'll never involve you in it, and I'll never let it affect our legitimate operations, but it will be part of my life until I can fully transition out. How long will that take? I don't know. Maybe years. Maybe it will never be possible completely. Sarah considered this. It wasn't ideal, certainly. But she thought about Marco's determination to change his life, about the 6 months his father had given him to prove himself, about the genuine excitement she'd felt as they'd talked through the possibilities for expansion. If you can promise me that our business will be completely legitimate, and that you'll never ask me to be involved in anything illegal, then I can live with the fact that you have other responsibilities, she said finally. You can promise that? I can promise that I'll try. But Sarah, you need to understand what you'd be getting into. Being associated with me, even in a legitimate business context, could put you at risk. There are rival families who would love to get leverage over my father by threatening his son's business partners. The thought was terrifying, but Sarah found that it didn't change her mind. Then we'll have to make sure we're careful. Marco reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were warm, and Sarah felt that same flutter in her stomach she'd experienced earlier. Why are you willing to do this? He asked. Why are you willing to take this risk for someone you just met? Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for the right words to explain something she didn't entirely understand herself. Because, she said finally, 3 years ago, when my grandmother left me this place, she made me promise her something. She made me promise that I'd never let it become just another business, that I'd always remember it was meant to be a place where people could find what they needed, whether that was good coffee or friendly conversation or just a safe place to sit for a while. And you think I need a safe place to sit for a while? I think you need a chance to become who you actually want to be instead of who you've been told you have to be. And I think maybe I need a chance to build something bigger than what I could do on my own. Marco squeezed her hand gently. If we do this, everything changes. Your quiet life, your predictable routines, all of that goes away. Maybe it's time for a change. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling between them. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving only the clean smell of rain-washed air and the promise of a new day. So, Marco said finally, if we're going to be business partners, I should probably know your last name. Sarah laughed, realizing that in all the intensity of the evening, they'd never gotten past first names. Bennett, Sarah Bennett. Nice to meet you, Sarah Bennett. I'm Marco Rossi, and I think we're about to change both of our lives completely. I think you're right. Marco stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street where just hours ago, black cars had waited in the shadows. My father wants to meet with me again next week to discuss the details of my proposal. I'll need to have preliminary business plans ready by then, including financial projections and timelines. I can help with that. I've got 3 years of financial records for this place, plus research I've done on expansion possibilities. And I'll need to start setting up the legal structure for clean investment. That will take a few weeks, but it's doable. Sarah joined him at the window, looking out at the quiet street. In the distance, she could see the first hint of dawn touching the horizon. Marco? Yeah? Earlier tonight, you said that in your world, there are only 2 kinds of people, those who have power and those who serve it. What if you're wrong? What if there's a third kind? What kind is that? The kind who choose to use whatever power they have to build something better. Marco turned to look at her, and in the growing light of dawn, Sarah could see that the wariness was finally gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked like hope. I guess we'll find out, he said. As the sun began to rise over the city, Sarah realized that her quiet life was indeed over. But looking at Marco, thinking about the plans they'd made and the risks they were willing to take, she found that she wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, she was excited about the future. 6 months later, the grand opening of Bennett and Rossi Coffee Company's second location drew a crowd that spilled out onto the sidewalk. Sarah stood behind the counter of the original shop, watching through the window as Marco cut the ribbon on their downtown location. True to his word, every dollar he'd invested had been clean, every legal document properly filed, every business practice absolutely legitimate. And true to her word, Sarah had never asked about the other parts of his life, the family obligations that sometimes took him away for days at a time. Their partnership had worked better than either of them had dared to hope. Marco's business instincts, combined with Sarah's understanding of customer service and community building, had created something neither of them could have achieved alone. But more than that, they'd created something together that felt like hope, a proof of concept that people could choose to build instead of destroy, to create instead of control. As Sarah watched Marco shake hands with local politicians and business leaders at the ribbon cutting, she thought about the night he'd first walked through her door. He'd been running from a life he didn't want, and she'd been hiding in a life that was too small for her dreams. Neither of them was running or hiding anymore. Marco caught her eye through the window and smiled, the same genuine smile that had transformed his face that first night, but without the sadness. He pointed to his watch and held up 5 fingers, indicating he'd be back in 5 minutes. Sarah smiled back and returned to preparing the afternoon coffee service. In a few minutes, Marco would walk back through her door, and they'd spend the evening planning their third location. But this time, she wouldn't be letting in a stranger seeking shelter from a storm. She'd be welcoming home her partner, her friend, and the man who'd taught her that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you need to do. The little bell above the door chimed as Marco entered, bringing with him the scent of rain and the promise of new possibilities.